And the girls would use some version of this system. They kind of adapted it and simplified it, but this was a kind of a turning point for them. Like, oh, fuck yeah, this is going to work really good. So while frightened, the girls then knocked out messages that they claimed to come from a murdered peddler who was buried in a farmhouse basement. In reaction, the neighbors decided to excavate the cellar to see if there was any truth, but fate intervened, right? So just sheer luck. There's tons of fucking rain, right? And the location near the creek, so the more they would dig, the more they would just find water. Right, so boom, you've got rumors. Boom, now you've got hauntings. Right, there's all this kind of rumor of hauntings has spread all around Hydesville, and it continued to spread throughout the countryside. And before long, the Fox's farmhouse was overrun with folks that hung out until night, and they just wanted to see what was up. Right, and some of the neighbors regarded them with awe as maybe divinely inspired folks that were chosen to interpret messages from the dead. And this is, as this is growing, right, they're going, fuck, right? So they had this attitude now that, they couldn't really say that this was all kind of made up, right? Have you ever been like that deep into like a story or like that deep into like a prank or something? You're just like fucking neck deep in it, and you're like, okay, I can't back out now. It just is what it is. I'm going to roll with it until I get through it. So just a wild time. And all this time, these rumors are circling, word is getting out. There's tons of folks that are visiting the house now. And it's just getting wild. So by the kind of 1840s, Americans were just obsessed with death. The American preoccupation with death was widespread. Cities were expanding. Immigration was at an all-time high. Factories and ports were booming. There was a tons of urban overcrowding. There was poor sanitation. We had tons of epidemics of cholera, whooping cough, influenza, all that kind of bad stuff. And the mortality rate was, boom, on the rise. We kind of talked about this, right? When you get into these kind of more trying times and death is kind of on the uptick, so is the necromancer. So nearly 1/3 of all city-born infants, get 1/3 of all city-born infants died before reaching their first birthday. And young mothers bearing an average of 5 children each were often fatally struck with with a fever, right? So they would die as well in a lot of these situations. So death touched all families, leaving behind millions of relatives with memories of those who had passed to the other side. So simultaneously, prosperity born of this urbanization was leading to a really big expanding economy and flooded the marketplace with, textiles, dishes, furniture. There was a new hope in materialism that kind of came out of this. And in this atmosphere, traditional religions, like Calvinism with its punitive doctrine of original sin, no longer seemed relevant, right? So Calvinism is like OG, old school kind of religion. A more significant approach to true worship of the divine, according to some, was brotherly concern for others expressed through meaningful social action. So kind of, looking out for each other. That doesn't sound like too bad of a thing, right? But by the 1830s and 40s, America's new breed of humanitarians had founded dozens of charities. There was lots of social causes. We talked about, there was causes such as abolition, temperance, prison reform. And there was this mood that was the establishment of like a 1840s utopian communities, that were kind of blossoming in America. So we were in kind of like this really big positive mood. These frontier towns were starting to pop up overnight. Railroads were expanding. Canal systems were expanding. There was now steam-powered boats and kind of all these really cool inventions like telegraphs and, that linked these once remote cities together. Right, so by the late 1840s, that anticipation of a better life and the concept of progress had become a national expectation, right? So there's a lot of growth happening. There's a lot of money being made. As we said, there's still a lot of tragedy. There's not much advancement. I won't say not much, but people are still dying, right? I mean, there's still a lot of folks dying at pretty high rates, infants and mothers, and as we kind of mentioned, and kind of like, John got the flu and now he's dead, right? John stubbed his toe and he kind of fucked up his toenail, and yeah, he died from that. It was pretty crazy. The Foxes were not particularly well wealthy. They were not in this position of kind of being the elite of kind of this Rochester, New York area. Their mother was a single mother. She struggled to support herself. She struggled to support her daughters. She basically gave music lessons to the kids around town, like rich folks going to put their kids in music lessons. So she was really doing that to try to keep things afloat. So around this time, too, we kind of have this period of religious revivalism, a.k.a. America's Second Great Awakening, just saying. There was like all these charismatic preachers. They appeared all over and in that town, right, in Rochester, in the Erie Canal communities. They came to offer salvation through a variety of evangelical and innovative sects. So among them were folks like I don't know, maybe like the Mormons, right? There were Mormons, there were Shakers, there were Millerites, there were all kinds of kind of newer things happening in the world of religion. And what happened with these folks is they basically abandoned their worldly goods and prep, right? They were prepping, they were doomsday preppers, right? They were prepping for the second coming that was predicted for 1843 and 44. So in the wake of the failed coming day of judgment, oh man, we just missed the apocalypse and other religious exuberances, a spiritual cynicism settled in, right? So to Lee Fox Fish, who had personally witnessed the evolution, the community seemed ripe for a new religious expression. So a practical woman with an opportunistic bent, she hastened to investigate the wrappings associated with Maggie and Katie. So determined to kind of get to the bottom of this mystery, Lee drew her sisters aside, and she's in promising to keep their confidence, asked them for the secret of what was going on. Repeatedly, Lee tried to reproduce the noises under Maggie and Katie's tutelage. So she's watching, she's trying to get them to reproduce this, but she could only make the faintest of sounds, so she couldn't do all these kind of loud bumps and creaks and things that they could do. Later, after inviting Katie to Rochester, hopefully, in hopes of practicing the skills herself, Lee claimed in her memoir later that the ghost had followed her to Rochester and so disturbed her house that she was forced to move. Yet Lee's next residence, half of a two-family house, was adjacent to a cemetery, an odd choice for someone that's looking to escape hauntings, you would think. But Mrs. Fox, the Mama Fox, soon joined Lee, Katie, with Maggie in tow. No sooner were they there, the sisters united. They grew bolder, filling the house with even more crazy ghost disturbances, right? Lee eventually decided that it was time to share the spirits with the world. So she appointed herself as the official interpreter of the raps. She demanded that Maggie and Katie conduct seances in Rochester, kind of under her watch, and attempts at escape now seemed to be futile for the rest of the family. They're basically looking at her saying that Lee was basically looking at him, threatening to accuse her and Katie, so Maggie and Katie, of deceiving her with the raps, just as they had their parents. So she's basically saying, if you all fucking bolt, I'm just going to say this was all you. And I was just I was scared shitless, and I thought it was real, but I found out you guys faked it. So intimidated, they just stayed around, and they were basically led around by Lee. Lee was kind of the person in charge. The very first to be invited were some of Lee's closest friends, a Quaker couple who were abolitionists, members of the Rochester Underground Railroad, leading social reformers. So it sounds like some pretty interesting folks. The middle-aged company had rejected this stuff kind of early on. But then they were like, okay, let's see. Show me what you're working with here. Show me what you got. Because this new idea of spirit communication as a faith was somewhat intriguing to them. So boom, there you go. Like so now we've got the whole group cooking, right? We've got all the booms, the knocks, all that stuff. We're in a house. We're doing seances. We've got one that's an interpreter. We've got all of this stuff kind of going on, right? So we're making it happen. We're making it happen. So during this seance, they kind of did their thing. The couple, as like most folks around that time, had lost several youngsters to illness And that's really what led them to participate in the seance. And so to their surprise, the messages Maggie and Katie rapped out, so the ones that they rapped out and Lee translated, were so personal as to be convincing. So they immediately became believers and soon and enthusiastically were promoting their belief in the Fox sisters and these spiritual manifestations to others. So before long, the Fox sisters were besieged with requests for seances, sometimes only Maggie, sometimes only Katie, sometimes with both. Lee presided over the meetings. Once guests arrived, they sat around a table, recited an opening prayer, and sang. After joining hands and sitting in silence, Maggie and Katie fell into a trance. Then the audience would hear the faint, ghostly sounds. Now, obviously, not everyone believed them. So, especially members of the clergy, they rallied against them as witches, as heretics. Some citizens considered the seances to be evil, unnatural. Still others thought that the trio was just insane, that they were just fucking batshit, right? So privately, Maggie continued to wrestle with her own concept of reality. So there might be some thing there with the whole batshit thing going on, right? Complementing this was Lee's sudden insistence that spirits were real. So there's this kind of point here where they go from like, practical joke to, oh, fuck, we're in over her head to, oh, shit, we could make some money off this to, no, it's real. Like, Lee got to the point to where she truly believed that it was real. So the concept was kind of lost on the rest of the sisters, and so they were left kind of confused, and Maggie became increasingly introverted. She just did not want to do this anymore. And so once Maggie decided to revolt, and she did so by refusing to rap for 12 days. So abruptly, the seances stopped. Lee got a little pissed, right? And then the household funds kind of went away. They didn't have any money. And this resultant upheaval was too much for Maggie to bear, and she's finally like, fuck it. Fine. We'll keep it rolling. We'll keep it rolling. So in the fall of 1849, Lee announced that the spirits had demanded that she and Maggie publicize spiritualism to the larger community. So she started doing that, right? She went out, she got a gigantic auditorium. They started doing all kinds of other stuff. They started charging for tickets. They were doing all these kind of seances. And during this whole time, there was like a committee formed, and they were like investigated. And they never really found anything. They basically just said that all the stuff that was going on, the noises, the knocks, all the kind of stuff that kind of made them their bread and butter, was unexplained. It was unexplained. And people were still critical of this, kind of saying that, well, those committees were flawed. They didn't really look at anything really in depth. So they did that for a while, and then in early June 1850, after touring Albany and Troy, the Fox sisters sailed down the Hudson River and arrived in New York City. While in New York, they shortly after arriving in New York, they started receiving guests and giving seances. Within 2 days of their arrival, they were invited to appear before some of Manhattan's most illustrious residents. So among them, historian George Bancroft, William Cullen Bryant, all kinds of kind of big deal folks at the time. That evening, Maggie and her sisters raised the spirit of Cooper's sister, and so precisely described her fatal horseback riding accident of 50 years earlier that the famous author instantly became a believer. So he's like, fuck, you got it, I'm in. Predictably, the Fox sisters, or Rochester Rappers as they were dubbed, that sounds like a pretty good rap group name if you want to get like hip hop, the Rochester Rappers, were besieged with requests. So they are busy, right? So to start out as a prank, now they're at the point of being freaking busy, and we're being employed by some of the most famous people, some of the most respected people at the time. After that New York reception, spiritualism was held as one of the wonders of the age. There was magazines, periodicals, all kinds of stuff that kind of started happening now. The nation's new believers, mediumship, with its odd knocking sounds and eerie messages, was kind of viewed as like a spiritual telegraph, which is just interesting looking back at it. Mediums appeared from Vermont to California, claiming that they too had spiritualist powers. Much like Maggie and Katie, many were pubescent girls and young women who were thought to have souls so pure that they were perfect intermediaries between two worlds. As its popularity continued to grow, the debate continued. Spiritualism founding editor of the New York Times, Henry Raymond,